Have you ever wondered why the mystics speak of enlightenment as both the greatest gift and the most terrifying ordeal a human being can endure? Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a cliff, and below you lies not death, but the complete annihilation of everything you've ever believed yourself to be. This is the precipice of spiritual awakening. And most people, when they reach this edge, choose to step back into the comfortable darkness of their unconscious lives. Carl Jung understood something that modern spiritual movements refuse to acknowledge. Awakening is not a gentle sunrise illuminating your path to bliss. It is a violent earthquake that splits the ground beneath your feet, leaving you suspended between two worlds, the one you can no longer inhabit and the one you're not yet ready to enter. The great question that haunts every seeker is this: why do so many people begin the journey of awakening only to retreat back into sleep? Jung called this phenomenon the encounter with the numinous, a confrontation with the divine that is simultaneously healing and destructive, creative and annihilating. The answer lies in a brutal truth that no one wants to hear. Spiritual awakening is not about becoming more of who you are. It's about discovering that who you thought you were never existed at all. Most people believe awakening will enhance their lives, make them happier, more successful, more loved. They approach it like a self-improvement project, expecting to add spiritual wisdom to their existing personality like a beautiful ornament on a Christmas tree. But awakening doesn't decorate your life, it burns it to the ground. Every relationship, every goal, every source of meaning and security becomes suspect. The very foundations of your reality begin to crumble, and you realize with growing horror that there is no solid ground anywhere. This is why most people never survive their spiritual awakening. They mistake the initial insights, the moments of clarity and peace, for the destination itself. When the real work begins, when the ego starts its death throes, when the familiar world becomes alien and hostile, they panic. They scramble back to the shore of ordinary consciousness, convincing themselves that those glimpses of truth were just hallucinations. The journey begins with a crack in the facade of your constructed self. Maybe it's a devastating loss, a moment of profound beauty, or simply the growing awareness that your life feels like a performance in a play you never auditioned for. Something shifts, and suddenly you can see the puppet strings that have been controlling your every move. You realize that the person you've been presenting to the world, maybe even to yourself, is nothing more than a costume you've been wearing so long you forgot it wasn't your skin. This recognition should be liberating, but instead it's terrifying, because if the self you've known isn't real, then what are you? The false self, Jung observed, is like a building constructed without proper foundations. It may stand for years, even decades, but when the earthquake of awakening comes, it cannot survive the tremor. Most people, when they feel this instability, immediately begin reinforcing the structure. They double down on their roles, hoping that if they just try harder, they can make the false self solid again. But awakening is irreversible. Once you've seen behind the curtain, you can never fully believe in the show again. The dissolution of the false self is not a gentle process. It's violent, chaotic, and utterly disorienting. Every certainty becomes a question mark. You look in the mirror and see a stranger. The very ground of your being shifts beneath your feet, and you realize you're falling through layers of reality you never knew existed. This is where most people retreat, convincing themselves that this instability is pathology, that the safest thing to do is reconstruct the familiar self as quickly as possible. But for those who continue forward, who allow the false self to die its necessary death, something extraordinary begins to emerge from the wreckage. Not immediately. First comes the descent into the shadow, the confrontation with everything you've refused to see about yourself and your world. The shadow self emerges from the depths like a long-suppressed prisoner, finally breaking free from its chain. All the rage you've swallowed, all the grief you've denied, all the desires you've condemned, they come flooding back with the force of a dam bursting. This is not the gentle self-acceptance promoted by popular spirituality. This is raw, primal, terrifying encounter with the fullness of your humanity. Jung understood that the shadow is not evil. It's simply everything about yourself that you've been taught to reject. In your family, you learned that anger was unacceptable, so you buried your rage. In your culture, you learned that Certain desires were shameful, so you exiled your authentic wants. Layer by layer, you constructed a personality that could survive in your environment, and layer by layer, you buried your authentic self beneath acceptable facades. The shadow holds not just your darkness, but your light. All the power, creativity, and wild authenticity that you sacrifice to fit in, to be loved, to be safe. When awakening begins, these exiled parts of yourself don't return politely. They explode back into consciousness with decades of suppressed energy, demanding to be seen, felt, and integrated. This is ego death, not the peaceful dissolution described in spiritual books, but a violent dismantling of every defense mechanism, every coping strategy, every careful construction that has kept you functional in the world. You feel like you're going insane because the very structures that have been organizing your reality are collapsing. The voice in your head that has been narrating your life starts to fragment and fade. In this space, you discover that you are utterly alone, not just physically alone, though awakening often brings profound isolation. You are existentially alone, face to face with the fundamental aloneness of being human, without the comfortable illusions of connection and meaning that most people use to buffer this reality. Your relationships begin to crumble because you can no longer play the roles they require. Your career feels meaningless because you can see through the artificial importance society places on productivity and achievement. This is the dark night of the soul that mystics have written about for centuries. But it's not a temporary phase to be endured. It's a fundamental reorganization of consciousness itself. You're not having a spiritual experience. You're dying to one way of being and being born into another. Most people cannot bear this level of disillusion. They experience what Jung calls spiritual inflation. They convince themselves that their breakdown is actually a breakthrough, using spiritual concepts as new forms of ego protection rather than allowing the ego to truly dissolve. Others retreat into despair, convinced that their awakening was actually a mental illness, trying to rebuild the false self with professional help. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in these words, if you've felt the ground of your reality shifting beneath your feet, then you're not alone in this terrifying journey. At Psychic Vision, we explore the depths of human consciousness that most people are afraid to face. Hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next will reveal the sacred secret that separates those who survive their awakening from those who retreat into comfortable unconsciousness forever. The truth Jung discovered about the void between death and rebirth will change how you see your own transformation. But for those who can stay present with the dissolution, who can allow themselves to die completely without knowing what will be reborn, something miraculous begins to emerge from the void. In this emptiness, you discover something that has been with you all along, but was hidden beneath layers of conditioning. Your essential nature. Not another identity to inhabit, not another story to tell about yourself, but the awareness that has been witnessing every experience throughout your entire life. This awareness is not personal. It's the same consciousness that animates every human being, every living creature, every particle of existence. This recognition doesn't come as a thought or insight. It emerges as a lived reality, a fundamental shift in the very ground of being. You realize that you are not the thinker of your thoughts, not the feeler of your emotions, not the actor in your life's story. You're the space in which all of these experiences arise and pass away. You are the awareness that has been present through every moment of joy and sorrow, success and failure, love and loss. But this realization doesn't bring the bliss promised by spiritual marketing. Instead, it brings profound responsibility. You can no longer pretend to be unconscious. You can no longer blame your circumstances, your history, your relationships for your experience. You have awakened to your absolute freedom and your absolute responsibility for how you meet each moment. The sacred emptiness is not a void to be filled. It's a space to be inhabited. It's the pregnant pause between the old self and the new, the silence between the notes that gives music its meaning. In this space, You learn to listen, not to the endless chatter of the mind, not to the demands of the world, but to the subtle voice of the soul that has been waiting patiently for you to become quiet enough to hear it. The soul doesn't care about your career advancement or social status. It doesn't care about your plans and carefully constructed future. It cares only about authenticity, about wholeness, about the full expression of consciousness through your unique human form. And it will guide you toward experiences that serve this deeper purpose, regardless of whether they make sense to your rational mind. In the sacred emptiness, you learn to surrender, not as defeat, but as the ultimate act of trust. You surrender your need to control outcomes, your attachment to specific results, your insistence that life conform to your expectations. You allow yourself to be lived by life rather than trying to live life according to your agenda. This surrender brings a power and effectiveness that your ego-driven efforts could never achieve. From this sacred emptiness, something new begins to emerge, not another constructed identity, but an authentic expression of consciousness through your particular human form. This emergence cannot be forced. It happens naturally, like a flower blooming in its proper season. Your authentic self doesn't need to be created. It needs to be uncovered, allowed, expressed. This emergence requires radical honesty, brutal, uncompromising honesty with yourself about who you are, what you want, what you value, what you're willing to sacrifice for authenticity. You can no longer pretend to love what you don't love, to want what you don't want, to believe what you don't believe. Yes. You can no longer perform happiness when you're sad, confidence when you're afraid, strength when you're vulnerable. This authenticity is not selfish, it's sacred. Because when you stop pretending to be someone you're not, you become available for genuine connection. When you stop performing emotions you don't feel, you create space for real intimacy. When you stop living according to other people's expectations, you become a permission slip for others to do the same. The power that emerges from this authenticity is unlike anything the ego has ever experienced. It's not the power to control or manipulate, it's the power to transform simply by being present. Your very existence becomes a catalyst for awakening in others, not because you preach or teach, but because you embody a possibility they recognize as true. This is radical presence, the ability to be completely here, completely now, completely yourself without apology or explanation. It's presence that doesn't need anything from anyone, that doesn't require validation or approval. Most people live in a constant state of becoming, trying to become better, different, more acceptable. The awakened self has abandoned becoming for being. This presence transforms everything it touches. Relationships become authentic connections rather than unconscious contracts. Work becomes conscious expression rather than desperate survival. Daily life becomes sacred practice rather than meaningless routine. Not because circumstances change, but because the one experiencing circumstances has been fundamentally transformed. The awakened self doesn't seek experience as it brings consciousness to whatever experience arises. It doesn't chase peak states or avoid difficult emotions. It meets each moment with the same quality of presence, whether that moment contains joy or sorrow, success or failure. This is embodiment, not the intellectual understanding of spiritual concepts, but the lived reality of consciousness expressing itself through human form. The awakened self doesn't just know truth, it is truth, moving through the world with the authority of someone who has died to everything false and been reborn as something real. After the dying and the emptiness and the rebirth, something extraordinary occurs, the return. But this is not a return to the world you left. That world no longer exists for you. This is the emergence of an awakened human being into a reality that has been completely transformed by your transformation. You discover that you didn't actually go anywhere during your journey. The world is exactly the same people, the same circumstances, the same challenges, But you are so fundamentally different that everything appears new. You're seeing the same movie, but from a completely different perspective, and the entire story has changed. The return is not triumphant, it's quiet, subtle, often invisible to those around you. You don't come back waving flags or proclaiming your enlightenment. You simply begin to live from this new depth, this new authenticity, this new presence that has emerged from the ashes of who used to be. People sense something different about you, but they can't quite name it. You're more solid somehow, more present, more real. You seem to carry a quality of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, a strength that doesn't need to prove itself, a love that doesn't require reciprocation. The awakened self becomes a beacon, not by trying to be one, but simply by being authentic. Your very existence becomes a reminder to others of what's possible for human consciousness. You don't teach awakening, you demonstrate it. You don't preach truth, you embody it. Its influence is subtle but profound. People find themselves feeling more peaceful in your presence, more able to be authentic themselves, more connected to their own deeper nature, not because you're doing anything to them, but because consciousness is contagious. When someone has genuinely awakened, their presence awakens something in others. You become comfortable with being misunderstood, with being alone in your perspective sometimes, with watching others choose sleep when you know they're capable of awakening. You develop profound compassion for the human condition, understanding intimately how difficult it is to choose consciousness over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, truth over safety. The return is also the beginning of service, not the ego's desire to help or fix or save, but the soul's natural expression of love through action. You begin to live in a way that serves the awakening of consciousness in the world, not because you should, but because it's simply what emerges from an awakened heart. You discover that you have become the answer to prayers you used to pray, the solution to problems you used to have, the peace you used to seek, not because you've become perfect, but because you've become real. And reality, even with all its challenges and imperfections, is infinitely more satisfying than any fantasy of who you thought you should be. The awakened self knows that this is not the end of the journey. It's the end of the search. You have survived your spiritual awakening not by avoiding the death, but by dying completely. You have not transcended your humanity. You have become fully human for the first time. You are no longer seeking awakening because you have remembered that awakening is what you are. And in this remembering, you become a living invitation for others to remember as well. Not through your words or teachings, but through the simple, radical act of being who you actually are in a world full of people pretending to be someone else. This is why most people never survive their spiritual awakening, because survival requires death, and death requires a courage that most people cannot summon. But for those who do make this ultimate journey, who do allow themselves to die completely to everything false, they discover that awakening was never about becoming someone special. It was about becoming someone true. Now, I want to hear from you, and this is crucial. In the comments below, tell me, have you experienced the shattering of your false self? Are you currently in the dark night of the soul, feeling like you're going insane as everything you believed about yourself crumbles? Or perhaps you've emerged from the void and found your authentic self waiting on the other side. Your story matters because it reminds others that they're not alone in this terrifying, beautiful process of psychological death and rebirth. Share your awakening journey below. Whether you're just beginning to see the cracks in your constructed reality, struggling through the shadow work, lost in the sacred emptiness, or learning to embody your true nature, every comment becomes a beacon for someone else walking this path. Jung believed that our individual transformation ripples out to heal the collective unconscious, so your courage to share your truth here at Psyche Vision could be exactly what another soul needs to hear to continue their own journey into authentic being. Don't hold back. The world needs your story of becoming real.